I've been on the verge of losing it all week, so we'll see if it survives this presentation today. Um, but like Carla said, please put questions that you have in the chat box, and hopefully we can get to those throughout the presentation. And then at the end, we'll definitely make sure to go back and review. Um, do any of you that are here today currently follow a vegan, vegetarian, or mostly plant-based diet? Or is anyone mainly just interested or curious in eating more plant-based or incorporating more plant-based foods in their diet? Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Okay, so there may be those of you who have an interest in eating more plant-based for a variety of reasons, including personal health, which of course we're going to be diving in to having a plant-based diet, how that impacts or can benefit chronic disease such as diabetes. May be interested for the environmental impact. Um, you may have an interest in the ethical impact of eating less animal-based products. You may just have a dietary preference. Maybe you just don't really enjoy eating meat or animal products. And then lastly, food budget, which of course was our presentation last month, and we dove into the cost differences of plant-based proteins versus animal-based proteins. All right, so some of you are curious, interested, slowly transitioning. Um, so next, I want to kind of go into the different types of plant-based diets. Um, so a vegan diet excludes all animal-based products. It's kind of the what is considered the most strict out of any of the plant-based diets. Um, Vegetarian is a little bit more of a loose term. Primarily, it excludes meat, but may include other animal products such as dairy. Um, Pescatarians are vegetarians who also enjoy eating fish. Lacto-ovo vegetarians, if you've heard that, include dairy and eggs. Mostly plant-based just means that there's no strong food rules, but meals consist mostly of plant-based items. And then lastly, a flexitarian is a vegetarian primarily, but doesn't strictly exclude meats or animal products. Um, and I will say, if you are following these things for ethical reasons, for example, you may want to kind of have more strict bounds around your diet. But I think that kind of moving away from really strong food rules and allowing ourselves some flexibility can reduce stress around diet altogether. And so I think these terms can be fluid, and by presenting these, I don't necessarily mean that you have to fit yourself in any one of these categories. All right. So if you follow a primarily plant-based diet, there are some nutrients that you will need to make sure that you are paying particular attention to. So we're going to go into those a bit first at the beginning of this presentation. So first of all, vitamin B12. This nutrient is of particular concern, especially if you follow a pretty strict vegan diet, meaning you're excluding all animal products, no eggs, fish, dairy. Um, this vitamin does not occur in plant-based foods, um, at least not in adequate amounts in our diet. It's a water-soluble vitamin that plays a wide variety of really important roles in our body, including red blood cell formation, neurological function, DNA synthesis, metabolism. Um, And if you switch to a vegan diet, often a pretty strict vegan diet, oftentimes um, people will feel wonderful right away. And then maybe 6 months down the road, maybe a year down the road, maybe a few years down the road, they may notice some things like low energy or just feel like their body isn't quite functioning right. Um, if they're not supplementing with vitamin B12, this could certainly be the cause. So it's really recommended if you do follow a very strict vegan diet to be supplementing with vitamin B12 and getting your levels checked when you get your annual blood drawn with your primary care provider. Um, there are a few vegetarian sources, including some fortified foods like breakfast cereal and then nutritional yeast. However, nutrition research shows that even if you eat these foods on a regular basis, you're not going to have adequate amounts of vitamin B12 from the diet to prevent deficiency. Excuse me. All right, so calcium and vitamin D. I think we all know that dairy is kind of the poster child of calcium, specifically milk, yogurt, and cheeses, which are, of course, all wonderful sources of calcium. There are, however, some plant based sources of calcium if you don't eat dairy products. Um, these include bok choy, kale, turnip greens, and collard greens. And these vegetables, particularly, are low in oxalate, meaning that our bodies can use the calcium that is in these vegetables. So, what's recommended if you follow a plant based diet is to be eating these. Greens, these veggies on a regular basis to get your calcium needs. Um, Spinach is also high in calcium. However, it is also high in oxalate, which is that plant-based compound, meaning that it's a less bioavailable form of calcium. Our body really isn't able to use it. There are also many fortified foods that are plant-based that are a great source of calcium, including plant-based milks or other dairy products. Almonds, tofu, and then in the United States, orange juice is commonly fortified with um, with calcium. And then vitamin D, when we talk about calcium, we really can't not talk about vitamin D. They both work together to ensure we are maintaining bone density, which is going to be really important throughout our lifetime, especially when we get to be older adults and we may be at greater risk of low bone density or osteoporosis. So we need both of these nutrients. Vitamin D is a nutrient that we primarily don't get from food. We primarily synthesize it from the sun. Um, through our skin. So those living at higher latitudes, like above the 45th parallel in the United States, for example, may not be getting adequate amounts of vitamin D from the sun in the winter. Even if you're outside on a sunny day in January, the angle of the sun in the sky and the light that it emits, our bodies just aren't able to synthesize adequate amounts of vitamin D from that light in the winter months. Um, Other individuals who are at higher risk of vitamin D deficiency are those who spend long amounts of time indoors, are really heavy sunscreen users, or really make sure that they're fully covered up. When we get older to older adulthood, we may not be able to synthesize as much vitamin D from the sun. And then those who have darker skin tones are not able to synthesize vitamin D as efficiently from the sun either. Um, so I take a vitamin D supplement in the winter, and it could be beneficial for many. There are some food sources, the richest are fish. There are some in mushrooms. And then again, vitamin D can be fortified in certain foods, such as plant based milks and egg yolks. Um, again, a lot of these, even if you eat them regularly, may not be able to provide adequate amounts of the vitamin to prevent deficiency. So, again, when you get your blood drawn next time you go to the doctor, just make sure to ask your doctor to see if you can get your vitamin D checked as well. Um, Something else that may be interesting to note is that if you follow a very strict um, vegan diet, meaning you want to exclude all animal based products, the synthetic form of vitamin D, or the vitamin D form that is in a lot of fortified foods, most often is not considered vegan because they actually use lamb's wool in the synthesis of that vitamin for fortification. So there are vegan vitamin D supplements as well. They're just going to be a bit harder to come by. So just something to know about vitamin D. All right, so next are iron and vitamin C. Um, so just like calcium and vitamin D kind of go together to help with bone density, um, iron vitamin C can aid in iron absorption or use in our body. So that's why I also included these on the same slide. Um, so there are two different forms of iron. One is heme iron and one is non-heme iron. Both of these sources are found in animal-based foods such as lean meats, poultry, and seafood. Um, but all plant-based sources of iron are considered non-heme, um, which means that they're going to be not quite as, again, bioavailable, not as easily used by our body as the animal-based sources. But some really great plant-based sources include fortified breakfast cereals or breads or other grain products, white and kidney beans, lentils, peas, spinach, nuts, and some dried fruits. Um, so if you don't eat animal products, however, you eat many plant-based products, especially lots of those that contain this iron, we want to make sure that we're also eating lots of vitamin C, since vitamin C aids in that absorption. Um, so vitamin C, thankfully, is very widely available in the plant-based world. Actually, more available in the plant-based world than in the animal-based world regarding food. Um, so some really great sources of vitamin C include things like citrus fruits, strawberries, sweet peppers, tomatoes, broccoli. Um, but in general, fruits and vegetables, that entire category, they're all going to be pretty good sources of vitamin C. All right, so next, I want to touch on iodine and zinc. So iodine plays a role, many roles in our body, including thyroid function. So dietary sources include seafood and seaweed. So really those animal-based or ocean-based foods, dairy products, and grain-based foods such as cereals and bread. Um, Many individuals in the United States historically were found to have an iodine deficiency. So they actually started fortifying a food that many of us ate in the United States in the form of salts, like table salt. Um, that is used in the US and Canada, as well as many other places around the world, as a solution to prevent deficiency. We have found some increased incidences of deficiency recently with the increased popularity of things like sea salts and Himalayan pink salts and all these other kind of trendy salts that are not iodized. Um, you may be thinking, well, I eat plenty of salt in like the food products that I purchase or eating out. But most of the sodium that is used in food products, in packaged foods, is not iodized. And so having some iodine through your salts that you have at home could be beneficial to provide that nutrient in your diet. And it's not that you need a lot, but just if you have a little bit, um, every now and then with your food that can be beneficial. So zinc is also another nutrient that we primarily get from animal-based foods such as oysters, red meat, poultry, seafood, and dairy products. And so, again, if you're excluding all of these from your diet, there are plant-based sources, including fortified breakfast cereals, beans, nuts, and whole grains. And then the last nutrient that I really wanted to touch on today is omega-3 fatty acids. So these are essential fatty acids. Um, they play a role in the structure of the lipoprotein layer that is the outer layer of our cells, all the cells in our body. They also play a role in hormone function and production. Really many very important roles in our body. Many of us may know omega 3s for their role in heart health and their benefits to eating them regularly for prevention and management of cardiovascular disease. Um, so omega 3s, some dietary sources are fish and fish oil, or krill oil is also pretty popular, fortified eggs, and then they can be found in yogurts and milks as well. Some plant-based sources are flax and chia seeds. Walnuts are kind of the rock star nut when it comes to omega 3s. They're the only nut that contains, or that's a source of these heart healthy fats, as well as canola oil, soybean oil, and soy beverages. So, the plant-based sources of these fatty acids are what's called ALA, which is alpha linoleic acid. It can be converted to DHA and EPA, which are essential, but that conversion in from these plant-based foods is somewhat limited. These fatty acids primarily come from fish and krill oil, and so if you do not eat these fish products, but you're eating, flax, chia, walnuts, canola oil regularly, you still may have a hard time getting adequate amounts. DHA and EPA are really important for things like brain function. Um, so that kind of leads in to my last slide on nutrients, and that is that if you have a hard time eating adequate amounts of any of these nutrients, or you try to eat adequate amounts of these foods that are great sources of all of these nutrients, but your lab work still shows that you are a bit low, it is perfectly fine to have to take a supplement to fill in those gaps in your diet. So the most common supplements are vitamin B12. You may see it if you're like in the supplement aisle at your store, you may see it listed as cyanocobalamin. Um, and this is recommended, like I said, primarily for vegan diets without really any animal products. And then it is really recommended to have your levels checked regularly by your doctor as well. Um, Vitamin D3, again, if you're supplementing with vitamin D, um, especially in the winter months, or if you don't feel like you're outside enough to get adequate amounts. Um, and then the form of vitamin D that I always recommend is vitamin D3. If you go in the supplement aisle, there may be different forms of vitamin D, but we know that vitamin D3 is the most easily utilized by our bodies to increase our levels in our blood. And then lastly, that EPA and DHA supplements, if you're having a hard time getting those in your diet, those may be helpful to supplement as well. Um, if you have questions about supplementing with any of these nutrients, or if you're interested, if you are getting adequate amounts in your diet, regardless if you follow a strict plant-based diet or not, because again, you can still have or be at risk or have deficiencies for these, even if you do eat animal products. talk with a dietitian or your doctor, and they can definitely help you figure out if there are any gaps or if a supplement would be beneficial for you. All right. So some negative experiences that um, I've seen with many individuals is they might start to follow a vegan or vegetarian diet and feel great at first, but then down the road have things like low energy levels, not really being satisfied from meals, have some unintentional weight loss, unable to maintain or gain muscle mass, and then poor quality of hair or skin. Um, and these are all symptoms or side effects that could absolutely be prevented if you are ensuring that you're getting adequate nutrients that we just talked about. And then also including nutritional balance, which we're going to dive into next. Oh, yes, I love that question. Carla, can you provide helpful tips on starting a plant-based diet? I'm going to circle back to that at the end and we'll definitely dive into some tips. Um, so, just like when you follow any diet type, it's important to make sure that you're balancing the nutrients, the food groups on your plate. And we're going to talk about some ways to do so if you are following a plant based diet. So, protein, um, there are several plant-based sources of protein. However, I think when most individuals kind of start transitioning to this diet, this may be the food group that seems the hardest to get adequate amounts of. So, some plant-based sources of protein include soy, such as tofu, tempeh, or edamame, legumes such as beans, lentils, peanuts, hummus, nuts and nut butters. I put walnuts here because we talked about them as being that great source of the fatty acids. However, all nuts and nut butters can be a good protein source. Seeds such as chia seeds, flax seeds, hemp hearts, and tahini. Whole grains such as quinoa, amaranth, buckwheat, whole wheat, wild rice, and oats, and then dairy alternates that may be soy based, hemp based. We're going to talk about dairy alternates as well. Um, but if you notice, if you are somebody who pays attention to how different foods impact your blood sugars and their carbohydrate amounts, some of these foods, such as the legume group, so beans or lentils, these are also starchy. So plant-based sources of proteins can contain carbohydrates as well in the form of like starches or fibers, for example, and so they may impact your blood sugars, whereas animal-based proteins really don't have those carbohydrate sources. So if you are individual diabetes and wanting to transition to more plant-based diet, that's just something to um, pay attention to when you are building a balanced plate and looking at the carbohydrates of your plate for blood sugar management. So there is a difference of complete proteins and incomplete proteins in our diet. So amino acids are what we call the building block of proteins, and there are essential amino acids of which we need all of for protein to function as it should in our diet. So all animal-based products are what we consider a complete protein. There are a few plant-based sources such as quinoa, soy, amaranth, buckwheat, spirulina, hemp seeds, chia seeds, and nutritional yeast. But the grand majority of plant-based proteins are what we consider incomplete proteins, meaning that they're a really great source of some of these essential amino acids, but not all. Um, so what to do about that is just make sure we're eating a wide variety of plant-based protein foods, and then also pairing them with grains because grains are often a good source of the amino acids that may be lacking or low in a lot of these plant-based proteins. So, for an example, if you combine rice and beans, that's a really easy and great way to make sure that we're getting all those essential amino acids for protein function. Another example is having like a peanut butter sandwich, Ezekiel bread, or like a pita with hummus. All right, so now that we talked about proteins, we're going to talk about grains. We want grains to be taking, or carbohydrates to be taking up a quarter of our plate, just like the proteins. And so, um, some carbohydrate source examples are going to be like grains, and we want to aim for mostly whole grains for that fiber source, um, to cause our blood sugar impact to be more gradual and not as rapid, like we've talked about in some previous presentations. Starchy vegetables such as potatoes, peas, corn, and winter squash, and legumes, such as beans, lentils, and chickpeas, which you've noticed, these are listed in the proteins and the carbohydrate section. Because they really can be both. And so, again, these foods are going to impact our blood sugars, being that they are a carbohydrate. But if we are having more whole food forms of these, so like the starchy vegetables, or the whole grains, where that fibrous layer has not been removed from the grain, um, that is going to decrease the blood sugar spike or make it much more gradual. Um, of our how our blood sugar reacts to these foods. And then produce, we want to aim for about half of our plate to be produce, um, and aim for a lot of colorful vegetables. This is a recommendation that any of us can follow, whether you follow a plant-based diet or not. So some examples of colorful veggies to include would be things like leafy greens, vitamin C rich produce such as peppers, strawberries, citrus, reds and orange vegetables or fruits such as tomatoes, carrots, papaya, and watermelon. White produce such as potatoes, cauliflower, and onion, and then blue and purple, such as berries, beets, and pomegranates. All right, so we've talked about proteins, we've talked about carbohydrates. Lastly, we're going to talk about fats. We want to make sure that we're including a plant-based source of fat with each of our meals. So this could be like sauteing vegetables in olive oil or canola oil, or other nut and seed oil. Using nuts or nut butters as a protein source, but those again also provide fat in our diet. So just like the legumes can be carbohydrates or proteins, nuts or nut butters can be a fat and a protein as well. Um, and then seeds. So I put tahini here, which is just sesame seeds ground up. So you can use tahini in like salad dressings or as a sauce or as a marinade. Um, or you can simply, have pumpkin seeds for a snack, sprinkle hemp hearts or chia seeds, or sunflower seeds on salads or soups, or grain bowls, any sorts of dishes. They can add some great texture. And then lastly, avocado, which avocado, of course, is a produce. However, it provides fat. It's a higher fat source than a lot of other produce sources, and therefore is considered a fat as well. Avocado oil is also gaining popularity to use for cooking. Um, all right, so some considerations for managing blood sugars when following a plant-based diet. Like I alluded to earlier, most plant-based protein sources also contain carbohydrates in the form of starches and fiber. So it's important to note that those are going to impact your blood sugars. Um, However, we also know when we are wanting to manage blood sugars that eating a carbohydrate with a protein and or fat is going to help to slow that blood sugar response. Um, and many plant-based foods naturally in their whole form are kind of a combo of a carbohydrate and a protein and or a fat. And so um, eating a lot of these plant-based protein sources, even though they will impact your blood sugars if they're in that whole food form. Um, I think we talked when we talked about how foods impact our blood sugars in an earlier presentation. Your blood sugar rocket isn't going to take off as steeply or quickly. It's going to take off at a much more steady rate, and that will prevent the blood sugar rapid increase and then decrease, um, and will help to keep more consistent blood sugars. Um, so, for most individuals, if you are including more whole or plant-based foods in your meal plan, this can definitely be beneficial for prevention and or management of diabetes, um, as well as other chronic disease states such as cardiovascular disease. But again, I think any body can benefit from including more whole plant-based food sources um, as in their diet, including more of these fibrous foods, since we know most individuals don't get enough fiber in our diet. Getting lots of nutrients from the variety of these different foods, and then the variety of vitamins and minerals as well. All right, so a few more food for thought, including, so you may be wondering, well, how am I possibly going to meet my protein needs if I am following a plant-based diet? So a really easy rule of thumb would be just making sure you're trying to include a protein source with each meal or snack. So, could you have apples and peanut butter with a snack? Could you have like tofu with one meal and beans with another meal? So, just making sure that you're trying to get a protein source with each meal or snack. Um, and then also, that protein with your meals will help contribute to feelings of fullness and satisfaction um, from our meals. So, if we're eating a meal or snack, we certainly want to feel satisfied to tide us over until the next meal or snack. If we're eating like vegetarian meals that are primarily carbohydrates, but pretty low in that protein source, we may feel full from them, but not necessarily satisfied. So be wary of processed food products. Some of these, so for example, like, there's a lot of meat alternates that are plant-based that you could use. They're convenient. You could use them in lots of meals for a tasty addition. They could be a protein source, but they also may contain additives that may impact your blood sugars. So that's just something to note. And again, kind of my rule of thumb is variety is absolutely key when you're following a primarily plant-based diet. All right, so I want to read a few of these questions before we move on. Would sweet potatoes impact blood sugar if eaten with proteins? So that's a really, really good question. So sweet potatoes are considered a starchy vegetable, just like potatoes, corn, peas, winter squash, which are in season right now. So they're starchy vegetable, meaning out of the produce category, they have a higher starch content, meaning that they have a higher carbohydrate content because starch is a carbohydrate. Um, so your blood sugars impact after eating a meal will always result from the total carbohydrates of a meal. So if you are having carbohydrates with a meal, that is going to impact your blood sugar. So if you're having sweet potatoes, it is going to impact your blood sugars. Um, if you are having a carbohydrate source that contains fiber, such as, starchy vegetables do contain fiber, vegetables in general contain fiber. Um, And if you are eating that sweet potato with the protein, um, it is going to decrease the rapid rise of your blood sugar. And so that would be a meal with like a sweet potato and a protein would be a really great way to maintain consistent blood sugars. Versus like, for example, white rice without a protein because that rice is a carbohydrate, but it doesn't have that fiber that the sweet potato does. And the starch that is in the sweet potato is a bit more complex molecule, more complex carbohydrate, and then that protein as well. So hopefully that answers your question. So yes, will impact your blood sugars, but that is because any food with a carbohydrate will impact your blood sugars, but not do so at a rapid rate. And then what are some fiber options? I love that you asked that, especially during this plant-based presentation. So we get fiber from all plant-based foods. So any food that comes from a plant is going to provide fiber. Animal-based foods don't necessarily provide fiber in our diet. Um, but when we are talking about plant-based foods, why I keep saying whole plant-based foods, is because some food processing can remove fiber from that plant-based food. So, for example, if we're talking about grains, and I'll use rice as a really easy example, um, the rice grain in processing, that you can purchase brown rice at the store, which is the whole grain, or that whole plant-based food. If that outer fibrous layer is removed in food processing, that is when we are left with white rice. Um, and so plants in general provide fiber, whether that's grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, or produce. But certain processing where that fibrous layer is removed removes quite a bit of the fiber that that food naturally um, provided. Um, so all whole grains provide fiber and are a good source of fiber. So if you think like buckwheat, amaranth, rice, quinoa, popcorn is considered a whole grain. Those contain fiber and they're a good source of fiber. Things like white rice or white flour, where that fiber is, there's whole wheat flour, which is the whole grain that contains fiber. But when that's removed, we're left with white flour that might make things like bread or pastas. That fiber layer has been removed, just like the rice example, meaning they're not as great of a source of fiber or very low fiber. Does that make sense? Hopefully, Wendell. Yeah, so it may say like on a grain product may say only 2 grams of fiber, but say whole grain. So when we are talking about bread or pastas in general, you always want to look for the word whole wheat or whole grain. Um, Sometimes they may just say wheat bread and like look a little darker, and may kind of visually look like they're a whole wheat product, but they're not. So we want that whole wheat or whole grain. And if you look at the ingredients list on a loaf of bread, for example, you want the very first ingredient to say whole wheat or whole grain because ingredients on the ingredient list descend by weight. And so the very first ingredient is going to be the primary ingredient in that food product. Really good questions. Hopefully that helped to clear it up and didn't cause more confusion. All right, so I wanted to dive in to, okay, what is white wheat bread? Um, So there's lots of different types of bread when you go in the aisle. There's different types of wheat grains, particularly, and so there's like red wheat and white wheat. But again, regardless of what type of bread, you just want to look for that word whole wheat. and you want to make sure it's the first ingredient, regardless if it's white wheat, whole wheat, or if it just says wheat, any type of bread. Um, okay, so I wanted to dive into dairy alternates because these may be something that you um, have in your diet. If you don't eat dairy products, you may have dairy alternates made with plant-based milks. So things like yogurt, you could have yogurt made with like cashew milk or soy milk, um, or like almond milk. Some may have um, well, I'm going to talk about the additives in a minute. So milk, there's lots of oat milk and almond milk and soy milk. And then there's lots more plant-based cheeses lately on the grocery store shelves. And so some things to pay attention to when you are choosing dairy alternates, especially if you are concerned about managing your blood sugars, um, is some of them can have a lot of added sugar to them, especially when we're talking about yogurts. And so if you are looking in the plant-based yogurt aisle, make sure that you are paying attention to the amount of added sugar to them. All yogurts are going to have sugar or carbohydrates in them. But if they have high amounts of added sugar, that could potentially be a food that is really going to rapidly increase your blood sugars. Um, Texturally, a lot of times these plant-based foods may have additives like added sugar to make them taste great and texturally be great. But just something to pay attention to, especially if you're managing your blood sugars. Um, some may be lower in protein, and some are better protein sources than others. So we want to aim, if you're having like yogurt with breakfast, again, we want to make sure that we're getting a yogurt that has a decent amount of protein in it. The same goes with these plant-based milks. Um, so the plant-based milks that are the best sources of protein are going to be soy, hemp, and some have added protein in them, like pea protein may be added in. Um, and then some may have added protein in other forms. So like the oat milks, those have really increased in popularity, and oftentimes those will be higher in protein. Generally, like cashew milk and almond milk, and most of these kind of nut-based milks are going to be lower in protein. So that's just something to pay attention to if you are choosing a plant-based milk and you want to make sure that it has an adequate amount of protein. Um, that's a good question. Coconut milk really doesn't contain much protein at all. Um, and then I'll get to the question about the protein bar next. Something else that is important to pay attention to when choosing dairy alternates is if they are fortified with calcium and vitamin D. So we know that dairy products are a really great source of calcium and vitamin D. If you do eat dairy products, if you really exclude those from your diet, we want to make sure that we're getting regular sources of those. So I would opt for a plant-based yogurt or milk or cheese that is fortified with calcium and vitamin D. Um, what nutritional protein bar would you recommend that would not impact blood sugars? So if you're choosing a bar, if there is one that has protein in it, that's going to be better than one that doesn't contain protein for managing blood sugars. And then I would choose one that has um, fiber in it as well. So that could be one that has like nuts in it, um, or seeds in it, or like whole grains. Um, and then if you want one that really isn't going to impact your blood sugars at all, you may opt for a low carbohydrate option. And they may be sweetened with things like sugar alcohols or sugar substitutes. So they won't impact your blood sugars, but they will provide protein. But we want to make sure we're having consistent carbohydrates in our diet to help manage blood sugars. And I went into that in pretty good detail in a previous presentation. So I'd recommend going back um, and listening to that if you want more info about that. Okay, so soy is soy something to be fearful of? I think soy has been one of those pretty controversial foods in the plant based world. Um, and it is that because it contains compounds which are thought to be estrogen mimicking. However, we know that soy does not cause breast cancer, and research actually shows that if soy is eaten on a regular basis, especially earlier in life, it could be preventative for things like breast cancer. Um, it is a wonderful addition to a plant-based diet, but remember, variety is key. I have worked with some individuals who, for getting their protein sources with meals, primarily are just choosing like soy-based protein products that you find in like the freezer section, um, which those can be a really convenient and wonderful addition to a plant-based diet. But remember that we want to aim for more variety when we're talking about plant-based proteins to ensure we're getting all our nutrients. Um, and like I said, there's lots of processed soy products available. All right. So throughout your lifespan, it may be more difficult to get adequate amounts of certain nutrients at certain points in your lifetime, including the elderly or older adults, infants and young children during pregnancy or certain disease states. And so these times in life, it may be difficult to meet all your nutritional needs. For example, if you follow a strict vegan diet, um, not to say that it's not doable, it's just recommended to really make sure you're working with a dietitian to help make sure you are filling in all your nutritional needs through your diet. And then lastly, many of us do not get enough fruits, vegetables, plant-based foods like these whole grains that we've been talking about in our diet. Most individuals living in the United States don't have adequate fiber in our diet, which not only can help manage blood sugars, but help with things like consistent bowel movements, colon cancer prevention. It can help to lower cholesterol. Um, and so adopting an eating style that includes more plant-based foods can be beneficial for anyone at any age. All right, some last things to take into consideration are what are your reasons for following a plant-based diet? Is it going to contribute or take away from quality of life? Like I said earlier, you can absolutely have a goal and easily incorporate more plant-based foods without feeling like you have to entirely make this switch to a strict vegan diet if you don't want to. Um, you can have flexibility and include more plant-based foods for all of these reasons. And it's if you're interested in incorporating more plant-based foods, kind of explore if this is right for you rather than feeling like this is what you should be doing or what you have to be doing. Explore easy ways to start incorporating more plant-based foods um, by maybe having some meatless meals a few times a week, slowly incorporating more whole plant-based foods like those whole grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, fruits, and vegetables regularly with your meals. Even if your meals still do contain some meat, you can still incorporate more of these um, foods. For example, swapping out half of your ground meat in your recipes with like lentils. Um, if you're making things like stroganoff or sloppy joes, things like that. Lentils are a really great addition. Meatloaf, you can add half lentils. You can always add like chickpeas in for half of the chicken and things like pot pies or like chicken salads, things like that. So just slowly starting to incorporate some of these plant-based foods, and then again making sure that we're trying to follow that kind of plate model, whether or not we're including animal-based foods of a quarter of our plate proteins, a quarter of our plate carbohydrates, and then half of our plate produce, and then some fats in addition in dressings or what you cook with, um, or as a condiment. Um, all right, so I've included some of my favorite, mostly plant-based food bloggers. Pinch of Yum, Dishing Out Health. She's actually a dietitian. Feasting at Home and Minimalist Baker. Um, these, not all of them are strictly vegetarian or vegan. Some of them are, but if you're looking to just include more recipes in your meal plans that have more whole plant-based foods, these are some of my favorites. All right. I'm gonna go back and see if there were any questions that I missed. Um, sugar, alcohols, Wendell. Yes, sugar alcohols are okay to have in your diet. They're not going to impact your blood sugars as much as sugar. They if I remember, I always get these backwards, but I think sugar substitutes don't impact your blood sugars, but sugar alcohols may impact them. Um, we don't want to be so a lot of foods that have a lot of added either sweetener or sugar substitutes or sugar alcohols are usually those foods that are going to be more processed, meaning they are really lacking a lot of things like protein and fiber and all these other beneficial nutrients. And so it's not that we shouldn't have them, but if we're having lots of them in our diet, maybe could we incorporate some more whole foods as well? Good question. Um, Protein bar, whole grains and fiber. I think we got to most of these. Okay, let's see. Is there a lot of sodium in plant-based frozen foods? That's a really, really good question. So generally, when we're talking about frozen foods in general, whether or not they are plant-based, they're going to be higher in additives such as sodium, which if high blood pressure or cardiovascular disease is of concern for you, you really want to be conscious of the sodium in the foods that you are choosing. If you are cooking foods mostly from home, you can really be able to control the amount of sodium in them. We know if you're primarily prepping more food at home, generally, most people are going to be eating less sodium than if they're including processed or prepackaged foods. That being said, convenience foods can absolutely help us to get a meal in our bodies, which is also important. And so you can utilize these frozen options every now and then. You can utilize them as a part of a meal. But if you're primarily eating these for your entire meal on most days, maybe start trying to incorporate slow steps to include some other whole plant-based foods that you can prepare at home. Are rice cakes good for snacking? That's a really good question. So, rice cakes, rice is a carbohydrate. And so, rice cakes are going to be something that increases your blood sugars. So, make sure just to pay attention to the carbohydrate amount on them. Certain rice cakes have added sweetener in them, which is going to increase the carbohydrate amount, meaning they will increase your blood sugar impact. Um, Whereas those who either don't have added sweetener or some are even made with like brown rice or whole grains in them, those aren't going to impact your blood sugars as much. If you have a rice cake for a snack or any food that is primarily a carbohydrate as a snack, I always recommend trying to add that protein source to them. So, like rice cakes with peanut butter spread on them, for example, would be a way to incorporate a more balanced snack for managing your blood sugars and make it filling and satisfying. That peanut butter adds that protein and that fat, which is, not only that snack in itself is going to fill us up, but we may be more satisfied until the next meal or snack if we add that protein and fat to it as well. Really good question. Anything else for our last 4 minutes. How many grams of fat should we get daily? So that is really going to be individualized and dependent on your own body. Again, fat is the most nutrient dense out of the three macronutrients, so carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So rather than fat taking up like a portion of our plate, like how I talked about the carbohydrate should be a quarter, the protein should be a quarter, the produce should be a half, and then I just said add a fat source. So that is because the fat is typically going to be the smallest portion on our plate. Because it's very nutritionally dense, very calorically dense. And we don't necessarily, so we need less of it than we need these other nutrients. And we want to aim to have proportionately more unsaturated fats. So, fats from a lot of these plant based foods, like we talked about, like nuts and seeds, the avocado, like on avocado toast, um, and the omega 3s. We want to have proportionally more fats from those than fats, saturated fats, such as like butters or coconut oil or animal fats, those fats that are solid at room temp. So if you're eating more plant-based and eating more of these plant-based fat sources, proportionately, that is what is recommended and can be beneficial for heart health. Um, and then, yeah, certain plant-based foods like the avocado, we talked about that's a fat and a produce. So even though it is a fat source, it has higher fat than most other sources of produce. It does also have fiber and some nutrients in it as well. So it kind of counts as both of those categories. The same goes for like nuts or nut butters or seeds or seed butters. They do contain fat, but they're also a protein source as well. So having like avocado toast or peanut butter toast, um, that's you would use more like peanut butter than probably like butter on a piece of toast. Good question.
Okay, everyone. Do we have one last question in our last minute? We want to thank you, Paige, for another wonderful presentation. It's so jam-packed with great information. Um, you want to talk about these resources again?
Oh yeah, I just the information on nutrients is found at this top sheet. Today's dietitian has a lot of great articles on diabetes, on following a plant-based diet. And then this last website listed Taylor Wolfram. She's another dietitian who's a vegan dietitian and has lots of really great articles on her blog about how to meet nutrient needs following a plant-based diet. And so that's why I listed that one as well.
Wonderful. So again, I'm sure you guys were trying to take notes. This video will be posted on our YouTube page. Give us about 48 hours to get it posted. You can also go back and see our other topics. Paige has been a wonderful presenter. We've also had others do live cooking demonstrations. So we want you to get the information that you need. So again, this takes place every fourth Wednesday. Continue to spread the word. Paige, are you accepting any clients right now?
I am, yes. I am accepting clients. I'm based in the Pacific Northwest in the United States, so kind of dependent on where you live in the United States. I may or may not be able to work with you, but I can certainly help point you in the direction of a dietitian if you are looking to work with one.
Okay. Do you provide any virtual assistance?
Yes, yep, I do. Most people still prefer telehealth, and it's easy for me. So Um,
Okay.
thankfully, that's one kind of good thing the last few years brought us is access to healthcare.
Wonderful. What's your website?
It is thekitchenrd.com. So that stands for the kitchen registered dietitian.com.
Thekitchenrd.com. All
Mhm.
right, you guys, if you want to reach out to Paige, check her out on her website. And again, we thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you next month on the 4th. It possibly will probably not be the 4th Wednesday because we will accommodate for the Thanksgiving holiday. So stay tuned for that date. More than likely, it will be the 3rd Wednesday. Okay, but you will get an email notification regarding that. And next month, we are going to have a live cooking demonstration with Chef Reggie, and he's going to have a healthy dish for the Thanksgiving holiday. So, again, thank you for joining us and check out our YouTube page. All right, bye bye and enjoy the rest of your
Mhm.
day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Paige.